welcome to the New America Foundation. Thanks for coming. I'm Paul Glapster. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Monthly magazine and a fellow here at New America. Welcome to the latest in a series of what we call big ideas that New America, in collaboration with the Washington Monthly and others, are putting forth in this very exciting time here in Washington. These are ideas we think have the capacity to change the national policy debate and help this country regain its momentum. In previous events, we've talked about a grand bargain with Iran. We've talked about the value of small, resilient community banks and the astonishing environmental and economic potential of freight rail, very wonky subjects. But today, we're going to go one better. We're going to talk about a story in the March-April issue of the Washington Monthly, which you can read at WashingtonMonthly.com. It's a story about a policy called feed-in tariffs, a terribly clunky and undescriptive name, which sounds like an agricultural tax. It's not. It's feed-in tariffs are, we believe, a potential killer app for renewable energy, a sector that has been very hard hit in the current downturn. It's a market-based way to pay average Americans to produce electricity for the grid, thereby moving us toward a cleaner energy future and helping rejuvenate the economy. We're going to be discussing this with a very distinguished panel, a very knowledgeable panel. We're going to be discussing the potential and potential pitfalls of feed-in tariffs. Before I get started, I just wanted to thank Troy Schneider and Kate Brown and Stephanie Gunter for setting up this wonderful event. I want to thank our C-SPAN audience. Also, we're being webcast here, several hundred of you watching on the web. We're very excited today to have this panel. Let me first introduce our first speaker, Mariah Blake. She's an editor at the Washington Monthly and the author of the story in the Washington Monthly called A Rooftop Revolution. She's former assistant editor at the Columbia Journalism Review and has written for such publications as the Christian Science Monitor, Mother Jones, and Foreign Policy. She's a recipient of several awards for her work, including from the Society of Professional Journalists. Next in line is Ed Regan, the Assistant General Manager for Strategic Planning at the Gainesville Regional Utilities. You'll find out why Gainesville is so important to this story in a moment. But in brief, Ed Regan discovered the feed-in tariff idea on a fact-finding trip to Germany, brought the idea back to Gainesville, and eventually persuaded the city council to adopt the policy. Last month, Gainesville became the first city in the country to enact this very interesting feed-in tariff policy. Next, Toby Couture. He's the an assistant at the he's at the Energy and Financial Markets Division of the Department of Energy's Renewable Energy Laboratory. What that means is he's the federal government's acknowledged expert on feed-in tariffs. He's a former Fulbright scholar, and I'm told semi-fluent in Greek, which is better than I have to say. And he's not, I don't think, Greek, and I am. James Bradbury is our next speaker. He's the senior legislative aide for climate and energy for Congressman Jay Inslee of Washington. Congressman Inslee is the sponsor of a feed-in tariff piece of legislation, the go-to guy on this issue, and James is his guy, so we're happy to have him. He played a key role in drafting the legislation and also co-authored a comprehensive report on state-level feed-in tariff proposals sponsored by the Heinrich Boll Foundation. Finally, representing the industry side of things is David Owens. He's Executive Vice President for Business Operations at Edison Electric Institute, the Association of America's shareholder-owned utilities. Mr. Owen has responsibility for overseeing strategic areas of energy supply, the environment, energy delivery, and energy services and international affairs, and he was formerly the chief engineer of the Division of Corporate Regulation at the Securities and Exchange Commission. So before I turn it over to the panel, just a couple of quick housekeeping points. First of all, New America is rolling, has a more and more emphasis on climate and energy policy. We'll be rolling out later this month a state climate policy tracker and organizing our second Governors International Climate Summit this fall. You can read about that at newamerica.net/climate. and also Lisa Marginelli, a fellow author of Oil on the Brain, and will be launching a soon-to-be-named energy policy program here at New America, and you can learn more about that at newamerica.net/big ideas. She's an author of another Big Ideas piece. So with that, one final thing. When we have some Q&A, we hope to get to the Q&A very quickly. We're going to be passing a microphone out. This is being taped. Please wait for the microphone to come. State your name and affiliation. So with that, let me turn it over to Washington Monthly editor Mariah Blake.
All right, apologize about the technical glitch. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and I also want to thank the people at the table here. Without these people, I wouldn't know half of what I know about feed-in tariffs. What you see on the screen here is basically an image of what the renewable energy market looks like in the United States. And the reason for this has to do with incentives. In the United States, the incentives for renewable energy are mainly tax breaks and quotas. And this system basically favors large projects, especially wind farms in remote parts of the country. And as a result of this system, there's generally limited financial benefits for local communities. This is what renewable energy looks like in places where there are feed-in tariffs. This picture in particular is a residential development outside of Freiburg, Germany. All of the homes are like mini power stations, so each of these homes produces 3 times as much energy as it uses. This is the train station in Freiburg. Note the strip of solar panels there on the side. I don't have a picture, but actually in Freiburg, the local soccer stadium is also covered with solar panels. The residents of the community pooled their money and bought solar panels for the soccer stadium. So. This is a village in the Black Forest. The village is called Freiamt, and it actually produces all of its own energy from renewable sources, plus enough extra energy to power 600 German homes. The man pictured here is Ernst Leimer, and he rallied residents to buy 3 90-foot-tall windmills. Each of them cost about $2 million. This is the Mellert grist mill and bakery. It's built in the 1700s. The owner recently ripped out an ancient water wheel and installed a modern water turbine. So this bakery produces all of its own energy from small hydro and also some additional energy. This is the inside of the bakery. This is a typical farmhouse in Freiamt. This is Spain. This is the national telephone company in Spain. It is about to build the largest solar office building in the world. And last but not least, this is Gainesville, Florida. Gainesville, as you'll hear more about later, just became the first city in the nation to adopt a feed-in tariff. And actually, I was in Gainesville in February, and the day after I arrived in Gainesville, there was the front page headline in the New York Times was "Dark Days for Renewable Energy," and the focus was the fact that the bottom had basically fallen out of the renewable energy sector. And meanwhile, as I learned while I was there, Gainesville was in the midst of a solar power boom. So that said, what is a feed-in tariff? A feed-in tariff is a policy that's in place in about 40 countries, and it requires power companies to buy renewable energy from anybody who produces it. No matter how small the producer, the power company has to buy renewable energy from them. There are different designs, but essentially in places where the policy is most successful, the rates are tied to the cost of production. So, for instance, energy produced from less costly sources, or more costly sources like solar, retrieves a higher rate than from more costly sources like wind. In these places, there also tends to be long-term contracts, so 10 to 20 years. And basically, the idea is to spur investment by guaranteeing a profit to anyone who generates renewable energy. Now, until recently, this policy was almost completely unknown in the United States. and it's still not a household name. But there's been a surge of interest in the last year or so, and at this point there's 11 states that are seriously considering adopting feed-in tariff legislation. And there's a bill for a feed-in tariff before Congress, and James Bradbury will talk more about that in a little bit. But the reason for this is the dramatic results that the policy has brought in places like Germany. And I actually lived in Germany until a couple months ago, and that's how I discovered the policy. And I'll talk a little bit about what the policy has done there. Germany adopted the feed-in tariff in 2000. At the time, its goal was to double the share of renewable energy, renewable electricity particularly, that the country produced by the year 2010. Now, what happened, in fact, was that it met that goal 3 years early, and it now produces 15% of its energy from renewable sources, and that's more rapid growth than's been seen in any other country. The situation with solar is particularly striking. I mean, the situation in Germany is interesting for the reason that Germany doesn't have particularly strong resources for renewable energy. So in the case of solar, Germany gets about as much gets as much sun as Juneau, Alaska. It's a very, very cloudy place. And yet it has almost half the world's solar generating capacity, and it produces more solar power than any other country except for Japan. In the case of wind, Germany is about half the size of Texas and is far less windy than Texas, and yet it is neck and neck with the United States for the #1 spot when it comes to wind power capacity. So, well-designed feed-in tariffs also bring additional benefits besides rapid deployment of renewable energy. They deliver renewable energy at a lower cost on a watt-for-watt basis than other mechanisms. They encourage small local generation. That's what I illustrated in the pictures here, which brings a number of benefits. One of these benefits is that since energy is generally produced where it's used, almost nothing is wasted. And this stands in pretty stark contrast to the way it works in many parts of the United States. So, for example, if I build a wind farm in Texas and that energy has to be transported to cities or to the coasts, as much as a third of that energy can be lost in transmission. Another major benefit of this is that the money is invested in the community generally, and this creates a cycle of more investment, more widespread economic growth, and greater job development. So at the moment, there are about 300 people working in the green energy sector in Germany. By 2010, that's expected to more than double, and green energy will be the nation's #1 employer, will employ more people than its legendary auto industry. The feed-in tariffs also have another interesting feature, which is somewhat complicated but also very important, and that is that the rates go down over time. So what does that mean? If I install solar panels on my roof this year, I get a rate. I lock in a specific rate for the next 20 years. If my neighbor installs exactly the same equipment the following year, they get a rate that is perhaps 5% lower. Now, why is this important? It's important for a couple of reasons. One is that it creates an incentive to get into the game as soon as possible. And the second is that it drives innovation, because the companies that produce solar panels or produce windmills have to continually find new efficiencies to drive down costs. And as a result, in Germany you see a lot of technologies, and in Spain, other countries that have feed-in tariffs as well, that you don't see on the market in the United States. You see things like solar photovoltaic roof tiles and solar photovoltaic glass. But perhaps the most compelling benefit of the feed-in tariff in today's economic climate is the 20-year contract creates investment security. And this means that feed-in tariffs are a safe bet for banks and investors. As a result of that, countries that have feed-in tariffs are continuing to see their renewable energy markets thrive right now in today's economic climate, and that is not true in most places that don't have feed-in tariffs. In most places without feed-in tariffs, you're essentially seeing the bottom fall out of the renewable energy market. That has been particularly true in the United States, although now we're starting to see the first glimmers of a revival as a result of the stimulus package. And with that, I will hand it over to Ed Regan.
Good afternoon.
I'm also going
to can share the learning on how to use this machine. Very good. What I'm going to do is, first of all, introduce Gainesville Region Utilities and what is it that's unique about our community that we have adopted this policy. And so part of that is to explain how we got there. It was sort of an evolutionary path, and what it means to our community, and some of the things we've learned on that path. To start off with, I'm sure everybody here knows that Gainesville is north central Florida, and we're the home of the Fighting Gators at the University of Florida. We've won a number of football championships and basketball championships. Proof that we are a smart community is that, as well as athletic, is that we have learned to spray all the utility poles up and down University Avenue after national championships with PAM. And that keeps the kids from climbing up there and getting killed. So we're very adaptable. What really, ironically, we are a electric, water, wastewater, natural gas, telecommunications utility. We do it all. We're fairly large for a municipal utility, and we are self-generating. We have coal assets. We generate out of coal. We have nuclear assets. We share parts of nuclear units. We have natural gas assets. So we're very, in many ways, very traditional in that regards. We're very involved in fuel markets and transportation contracts. Rail is big with us. What really started us off, I think, I was actually hired there almost 30 years ago to set up the energy conservation programs in response to the Arab oil embargoes and the regulations that came out after that. I have then progressed. I'm now the Assistant General Manager for Strategic Planning, and so I have all the long-term facilities planning. I do the bulk dispatches under me, all of our power marketing, fuels, all those kinds of things, as well as rates and financing. What actually started us on this path was when us, as being smart staff, we're looking ahead. We're looking at least cost, which is utilities. Believe it or not, it's genetic. We have to try to get things done at the lowest possible cost. That's what we all try to do. Everybody in utility business that's been our primary objective since God knows when. We came in with a least cost solution for our long-term energy plan, given that we're growing and needed more capacity, and we had older units that were going to retire. And our least cost plan was, shock, a coal unit. Well, that provoked a conversation and a debate that just raged in Gainesville, and the obvious issue, the elephant in the room, was, well, what about climate change? What about CO2? And coal, in particular, has a very high ratio of carbon per unit of energy. That whole conversation affected people's political careers. It affected people's professional careers. It was not an easy discussion. But today, what our community is doing is, first of all, we're committed to meet the Kyoto protocols, which is reducing our carbon emissions for the whole community by 7% from 1990 levels, which is pretty tough in Florida, which is a growing area. And our primary mechanisms for doing that are very aggressive demand-side management, or energy conservation, and renewable energy. Now, we've always kind of thought of it as part of our conservation plan, but so as we have rebates and incentives for people to do solar electric, like you see here. We have rebates and incentives for solar thermal. We're going to focus today primarily on solar electric. You kind of have to walk before you can fly, and that's where we're rolling out our first feed in Tariff, is in the area of photovoltaics. We had rebates, which are based on what our expectations are of our future generation costs and our future fuel costs. And I have to tell you that the fallacy of the forecast is that you can forecast. The little saying we have in Gainesville, as soon as you publish a forecast, you know it's wrong. I got to tell you that nobody last year expected the fuel markets we're seeing today. And so it's very, so this rebate stuff, who knows where you are on that. And that affects all of our conservation programs. And we also have a program that's very common in the United States called net metering, where if you put a solar facility on your house, you use the electricity in your own home, and anything left over goes out to the grid, and they pay for that difference, and it's called net metering. What we were learning was there were a lot of operational and other kinds of problems with net metering. First and foremost, all the big flat roofs that are out there. Who wants to cut down trees? By the way, Gainesville is Tree City, USA. We've had that award twice in the last 30 years. Lots of trees. Who wants to cut down trees to put up photovoltaics on people's houses? You ought to be putting them out there. This is my commission thinking. On the big, the drug stores, the grocery stores, on the parking lots. And it was not happening with net metering. Why? Because under net metering, large customers do not do well at all because they have two-part metering where they have a demand meter. But let's just say that net metering is not equitable among customer classes. The next thing is that one of the problems with the rebate part of our program is you're putting all this money, you're giving somebody money for putting in a system, and I can drive around town and see the solar water heating systems that are under trees are broken and not working, and my community invested in that. There's no sense of pay for performance, which meant that more and more we were becoming the solar police, and that was not comfortable. So as we were going through this whole policy debate and developing our programs, there was this one gentleman who kept standing up in the audience and saying, because we believe in public outreach and we let the community participate in our decisions, I need to say that we are a municipal utility. Municipal utilities are very different than investor-owned utilities in terms of their policy making and their financial incentives. We are owned and operated by the city of Gainesville. Our board of directors are elected officials, so they directly reflect the community. The second thing is that as a municipal utility, we cannot get the kinds of tax incentives and rebates that are available to other kinds of utilities, investor-owned utilities. That difference of municipality versus investor-owned utility is huge when you come to considering a policy like the feed-in tariff. And I'm sure Mr. Owens will be discussing that more later. So this guy was getting up on our meetings and saying, you should do what they do in Germany, and they pay 85 cents a kilowatt hour for solar electricity, keeping in mind that currently our rate is something like less than 14 cents a kilowatt hour in Gainesville. And I kept sitting there thinking, how in the world are they doing that? You know, is this guy pulling our leg or what? In the meantime, there's a lot of discussion in the power industry about grid reliability. What are there harmonics from these inverters? All this technical stuff. And there's an organization called SEPA, the Solar Electric Power Association. And this is an information group that Gainesville was helping to fund because we were involved in solar. And they put together a grant program to go and find out how renewable in all forms is working out on the grid in Europe. So I wrote my part of the grant and got to go on the trip. And so that's the Solar Electric Power Agency took us out there. And what I learned there is, first of all, why the feed-in tariff? And it was just a mind-boggling experience because it was not thinking at all like a utility, which is the lowest possible cost. What Germany is thinking about is energy independence. What Germany is thinking about is, what if we don't have friends? Germany at that time was importing 75% of their energy. They could not afford to let any part of the renewable energy portfolio get away from them. And so that was very eye-opening. The other thing was, everywhere I went, I would say, who gets the renewable energy credits, which is what's driving a lot of investment decisions in America. Nobody knew, nobody cared, because they had this other system. And what I saw, and I'm going to show you, was what it meant, the spirit of optimism, the jobs, the employments. It was very, very sobering, to tell you the truth. So just kind of give you some ideas of the things we saw was also how far advanced they are in some of their technologies. Now, a lot of the basic technologies that are being deployed throughout Europe and the Pacific Rim came from America. It's almost like they invented here and then go somewhere else to do it because we don't really have the economic models that let that happen. Big investments. I got to tell you that we have not seen the beginning of the solar revolution. Right now, a very good PV system is maybe 12%. At this place, they showed me systems that were 40% efficient. One of the pushbacks, probably the only pushback on the feed-in tariff that I've gotten in Gainesville, what amazed me was how our community supports these rate increases. These will cause rate increases, but they support them. The pushback is if we're going to do renewable energy, if we're going to meet the Kyoto Protocol, why fool around with solar? Of all the renewable energies, photovoltaics are probably one of the most expensive. And the reason is the same answer as to why do cows eat grass? Because there is so much of it, and once you figure out how to grow that third stomach, you're home free. So that's the answer to that question. This is just to show you that in Germany they have feed-in tariffs for virtually any kind of technology, also reflecting the various regional differences. The point is that you could easily do that in America. Now in Gainesville, we have to walk before we can fly, so we're just doing solar photovoltaic. The other opportunity in Florida really is mostly biomass. It's kind of hard to build wind farms for hurricanes. Here's an example of where the technology is taking giant leaps. Currently, photovoltaics are actually quite inexpensive. You can get modules for $2 a watt. The most expensive part of it is the installation. And the other part of it is that the transportation and a big part of the cost of solar modules is the glass. So what happens when you build the glass with the photovoltaics in it? This is a product that you would use for a skylight, which means that the cost of the skylight is subsidizing the cost of the photovoltaic. This kind of deployment is nothing like what we're seeing in America. Over here on the right is a roof that's made of slates that are photovoltaic slates, and how to integrate it with tiles. Actually, Mariah showed you this project. This is from the other side. This is how department stores are getting into it. It's amazing how many different kinds of applications you'll see around the world. This is what we were not getting in Gainesville because of the net metering policies and the rebates. We were not seeing these huge roofs being covered with not only do these things make electricity, but they shade the roofs and reduce the cooling load, which is very big in Florida. Here's one on the side of a landfill. It's already oriented. I thought that was kind of clever. And here, an interesting point is if you look over here on the bottom left of the picture, you'll see that a lot of stuff grows under solar arrays. And it turns out that the most prevailing mode to manage that is sheep. I said, well, why not goats? And they said, well, goats, they jump on things and they chew on wires. You don't want goats. So sheep. Here's a large sheep farm. I had to have a solar cooker. We've all had solar cookers in our academic careers. These are some of there's a solar thermal. There's a big one being planned in Florida, and different kind of concentrating systems, which make a big difference. Oddly enough, I saw a lot more solar air conditioning using a system like the one on the right here that makes a little bit of electricity at the same time that it makes hot air. The electricity drives the fans and the blowers. The hot air dries the desiccants so that you can air condition your buildings. You can make this stuff flexible. University of Florida is working on plastic photocells. Once you start making them flexible, you can glue them on roofs, you can put them on cars. It's really no limit to your imagination. And here's the sense of optimism that I picked up from being over there is we went to a trade show and seeking distributors worldwide. And those were all European countries moving into the world, not American companies moving into the world. And what struck me was that Germany had the highest net import ratio of debt of income compared to any country in the world, including America and including Japan. It's a small country. So that's what we learned. So I came back to Gainesville, started talking about this stuff, and my commissions, they got it. We have 7 elected officials who got it, that this is all about economic development. They really like the idea that this is not just utilities participating investment, but that this is mom and pop can do it, Ace Hardware can do it, the banks can do it, our local banks. And so the more we talked about it, the more they seemed like they wanted it. So staff made the proposition. Just to show you how easy this was, we first had our first public workshop in October of 2008, and we were full-fledged and under operation by February 5th of 2009. It was the simplest rate design I have ever done in my life. I've done a lot of generation planning. It's very complicated. You got to deal with all these forecasts. This is a situation where you start off, you're not saying, what's the least cost or what will it cost? You say, what does it take to make a known cost make a rate of return? And the argument in our community was, what is the appropriate rate of return? What we picked was a 5% internal rate of return after taxes for a company that had tax liabilities. So the benefits are not as good for residential because they can't depreciate the same way a business can. And it also leaves out people like not-for-profits, like churches and schools. Well, if you go to the website for the Alachua County School Board, we're in Alachua County in Gainesville, Florida, they have a proposal. They're looking for who's going to give them the best rent for the roof. When we launched this thing, the official date when the PSC approved it was March 1st. Well, here we are, whatever today is, April 10th. We've had 40 megawatts worth of proposals coming, applications.
Ed, and just to give people some context, can you talk about how much capacity Florida has right now, the entire state?
At the end of 2008, they had about 4 megawatts in the entire state of Florida. A little bit pathetic. Now, I will say that as we went through the conversation of rate of returns, we did put a stop loss. In other words, the solar, we're paying 32 cents per kilowatt hour for the solar under one set of tariffs. There's another tariff for Greenfield, which is less. And that's obviously more than our customers normally pay. And so we have so all of the customers are going to pay for this relatively expensive fuel supply, if you will. And we put a stop loss in of 1.5% increase on the base rate, which is just about a 1% on the overall cost of the electricity. And that is about 4 megawatts a year. So we stopped taking reservations through 2012. And obviously we've had a heck of a lot more applications. It's a first come, first serve. We have been overwhelmed. We thought the first year we get 2 megawatts and 4 megawatts the second year, and it's just been a landslide. We have been sucked into a lot of kind of interesting policy debates, this is one manifestation of it since then, just because we're doing this. And we're doing it because my community is obviously very green, and because of their experience with football, very smart. The main policy concerns that I think, and I'm not here to say that the feed-in tariffs are for everybody, but boy, I got to tell you, one of the things that we're spending a lot of time in Gainesville is how to get our hands on some of that stimulus money. And that's going on all over this country. And the bureaucracies that are being created to manage that are just really daunting. If the country had a feed-in tariff, I got to tell you that utilities and public utility commissions, I mean, we got our financing thing worked out in a week. In a couple of months with some modeling, I mean, this would be very easy to do. Can you just imagine if the stimulus thing shifted all that decision-making to the private producer level? You know, what project am I going to do? And the other thing we notice is that the feed-in tariff creates a heck of a lot more competition than if we went out and said, we're going to do a 4 megawatt plant. Well, that leaves out a whole lot of small operators. It doesn't give any of my customers the opportunity to invest. And that may be one of the reasons why this went over so well, is that anybody in Gainesville can look at this and say, you know what, I could do that. I could partner with my friend. You know what, we could put together a syndicate and do one of these. And you know what, that's exactly what's happening throughout Europe. We're seeing pension funds, we're seeing farmer co-ops, all of these kinds of things investing in these systems. But so here are the utility policy issues. First of all, we're shifting the means of production from central utilities like Gainesville Region Utilities out into the consumer, out into the private sector. Everybody can become an energy producer. And I have to tell you that there are people in my organization that this makes them crazy. Why are we doing this? Well, at least I have the easy story, because it makes no sense for us to do it because we can't get these tax credits. That's not true for investor-owned utilities. The second thing is we're letting revenue opportunities get away. In other words, because we don't own it, we can't earn a rate of return on it. And if you're an investor-owned utility, you live and breathe for one reason, and that is to make money for your shareholders. If you're a municipal utility, my commissioners are thinking about jobs. They're thinking about investment opportunities. They're thinking about keeping our money local. I had the president of the IBEW, International Brotherhood of Electric Workers, come to me the other day and say, thank you, Ed. And I said, why? Well, in Florida, and as in much of the country, and particularly in Gainesville, development has come to a standstill. He says, my union brothers, they're all employed. They all have jobs because of this policy. Thank you. So those are the reasons why we're doing it, which is a little bit different view than conventional utility economics. And with that, I'd like to conclude my remarks.
Okay. Next up is Toby Couture from the National Renewable Energy Lab.
Well, that's great, Ed. I almost feel like you've covered the spectrum, and I should almost pass it on. It's a good thing I didn't bring slides, because I'm directly in front of them. So I've opted not to, and I'll just talk a little bit more generally. So I'm coming from the National Renewable Energy Lab, and as you can imagine, the lab has been doing research on feed-in tariffs. As it started to pick up, we started to track some of the developments, look at some of the trends, look at where Germany is, at where Spain is, at where some of the leading countries in the world are, and this is a policy that has garnered a tremendous amount of interest, not only in Europe, but from around the world. Last week, South Africa just approved its feed-in tariff, which is one of the most, certainly among the most robust feed-in tariff policies. We've seen interest from certain parts of China, certain districts. We've seen interest from Turkey and from Australia. Tasmania now has a feed-in tariff bill. It's starting to pick up around the world. So we started looking at this trend a number of months ago. It's about a year ago, I guess, roughly now. And started doing the research. Why does this work? So that's what I'd like to focus on. We've seen that the countries that have feed-in tariffs have the most the highest level of effectiveness in terms of renewable energy deployment, in other words, megawatts installed. And we've also seen, somewhat counterintuitively, that feed-in tariffs have also, the countries that have feed-in tariffs have also successfully developed renewable energy in a more cost-efficient way than countries using competitive tendering, which is a common approach in both the US and the UK. And there's a lot of data to back this up. And we can as we started to look through this, we started to find that a fairly surprising result, and we started to wonder why. So why is that? Why are feed-in tariffs so successful? And I'll just focus on some of the kind of broader concepts just so that everyone can appreciate what actually makes this policy function. So as Mariah mentioned, feed-in tariffs offer a long-term contract for electricity sold to the grid. Anyone can participate. So you can be a citizen, you can be a farmer, homeowner, as we saw from the pictures. Anybody can participate. It's a non-discriminatory access. You get guaranteed access to the grid. In other words, there's no question of whether you'll be able to connect or not. It's just a question of working out how you're going to connect. And the third thing is you get a guaranteed price. And that price, and the crucial part to successful feed-in tariff policies, is that the price is methodologically based on the cost of generation. So if solar costs this much, you pay that much plus. So in the markets, this is called the cost-plus approach. And it's been around for decades. The idea is you offer a cost over time that will adequately recover your investment, whether you're investing in solar power, in wind power, in biomass power, whether you're burning agricultural feedstocks or wood chips. You essentially assess what the cost of that generation will be over time and what it would take to get a target rate of return. The target rate of return differs from one country to another, as you can well imagine, and it likely will differ from one place to another in the United States. But the idea is to target a certain rate of profitability that's sufficient to drive investment. So another thing that we've seen is that in renewable energy markets, counter to traditional energy development, if you look historically, renewable energy, or energy development, sorry, has happened where the resources are. So with oil and gas, you go where the oil and gas is. With coal, you go where the coal deposits are. And that's where the economic development happens. That's where the actual resource development happens. Now with renewable energy, it's interesting to note that it actually goes against that trend. Germany has a far less robust wind resource than countries like the UK, yet they have 5 times more installed wind capacity than the UK. So if you think in traditional terms, the UK should have far greater renewable energy development. Well, why is that? Where renewable energy development is happening in the world today is almost entirely a function of policy. So we've seen Germany, Spain, Denmark. The countries in the world that are leading the market in renewable energy are the countries that have the best policies. So this has kind of led us to take a step back and think of policy in some ways as a magnet to investment. Jurisdictions with successful renewable energy policies that enable a reasonable rate of return and that minimize risks have had a lot of success attracting investment. And we've seen that pattern repeated in every country that has developed them. The Canadian province of Ontario has the most widely recognized feed-in tariff in North America. There are a couple other states that do feed-in tariff-like policies, but again, they're not based on the cost of generation. Gainesville Regional Utilities is the first jurisdiction in the United States to base their feed-in tariff on the cost of generation. So a number of other utilities throughout the U.S. offer a payback price. So you can sell in Madison or in Wisconsin, for example. You can sell electricity to the grid, and they'll give you a number of utilities will give you a fixed price for that purchase. So it's technically a feed-in tariff, yes, but the difference is that it's not based on the cost of generation. They haven't done the due diligence on what the actual costs are to secure the investment. So when you look at the jurisdictions like Ontario, they've now, since they're now proposing to upgrade their feed-in tariff to a more aggressive level, they've had interest from some of the largest solar manufacturers and wind power manufacturers in the world to set up shop and start manufacturing in Ontario, because Ontario has committed to completely shutting down their coal generation by 2014. So they have 5 years to meet, I forget what the numbers are, but it's over 10,000 megawatts of new installed capacity. So you have manufacturers lining up. So one of the, again, taking a step back, feed-in tariffs have been successful because they offer anyone the ability to connect to the grid and sell power for a reasonable profit. Anybody can become an independent power producer and make a reasonable rate of return. So you can choose to invest in things like mutual funds or treasury bills or any of a number of low-risk investments. What feed-in tariffs do essentially is they make renewable energy another one of those low-risk investments. And you can put it on your own rooftop. You can put it in your backyard. If you're a farmer, you can centralize your feedstocks and actually use those to generate electricity. So there's a number of different economic benefits that flow from that, as you can well imagine. Germany currently has, as Mariah mentioned, just under 300,000 jobs created in the renewable energy sector alone, the majority of which are in wind and biomass. Solar is roughly half of where the jobs in wind are, but there's still a tremendous amount of growth and a tremendous amount of capital flowing into Germany to capitalize on this market because it's created a guaranteed growth market. The other thing from an investor standpoint, and I'll make one final, probably reaching the end of my time here, but another crucial difference from a job creation and investment standpoint, in the past, if you look at the graphs from 2000 to 2008 on installed wind capacity in the United States, so you see a bar graph. We have really high development in one year and virtually no development in the next year. Very high development in one year and very low development in the next year. Empirically, that's a pretty curious result because most markets, when you start getting development, it ramps up in a kind of gradual way. In the U.S., that hasn't been the case, and the primary reason for that is that wind development has hinged almost entirely on the presence or absence of the production tax credit. This is a federal incentive that was put in place to offer large investors the ability to offset their tax liabilities by investing in wind power. So when the tax credit was in place, hundreds of megawatts were developed, thousands in some cases, in some years. When the tax credit was, when there was uncertainty over whether the tax credit would be renewed or not, development ground to a halt. And you saw that pattern from 2000 to 2008. We've seen that start and stop pattern. Now, if you put yourself in the shoes of a manufacturer, that is problematic. And that is actually, we were speaking with some representatives, I can't name particular companies, but who have been considering investing in large wind development, manufacturing development in the U.S., and because of the start and stop nature of the production tax credit, they've deferred those investments. They've decided not to make them because there's not a guaranteed, there's no guaranteed stability in the growth of the market. So it's actually deterred significant amounts of investment in the U.S. because of the start and stop nature of that policy. Under a feed-in tariff, because countries like Germany and Spain have had longer, they've essentially established the policy, the terms are transparent, they're known to everyone, and they try to minimize what's considered political risk from policy adjustments. So they don't tweak the policy or adjust it too dramatically or too unexpectedly. Everything is on a planned schedule so investors know what to expect. What that does is crucial. It enables investors to develop a longer planning horizon. So they can actually think 5 years in advance. They can think 10 years in advance. And they can look at the market trends and actually build and plan their manufacturing around that because you have a more stable market for growth. So all those factors, and there's a number of different dimensions to this, but we've, in our analysis at the lab, kind of pulling all these strands together, trying to better understand why these policies work. And now we're starting to get a better understanding of the actual mechanics of feed-in tariffs, both from a design standpoint and from a market impact standpoint. So that's a little bit of the overview. Before I wrap up, there's currently one of them available on the website. We've been working on a number of different publications on feed-in tariffs, a few smaller reports, and one larger design report that's coming out in the next month or so. So there are a few of them available on the website if you take a look. I think it's under energy analysis, and you can go to publications. And more of those will be becoming available online. Some of them are shorter, so they're a little bit more, and there's one on the U.S. focus, with a U.S. focus that summarizes a little bit of the state of the debate and that provides a little bit more background on some of the issues that I've talked about here. So I'll leave it at that and pass it on. We'll leave for question and answers after.
And if it's all right, I'd like to add a couple things to what Toby was saying about manufacturing infrastructure and the investment tax credit. In the 1970s, the United States controlled, and up until I think the late 1980s, the United States controlled 75% of the wind turbine market, and today it controls just 17% of the wind turbine market. The reason that we've lost so much ground in manufacturing is the instability. So, I mean, and what's happened is who controls the wind turbine market today? It's Spain, it's Denmark, and it's Germany. So. And we're importing our windmills, the windmills we build, a lot of them, almost half of them, from these countries as a result of not having the manufacturing base. The other thing about the investment tax credit, which has been the primary driver of renewable energy in the United States, is that it requires big companies to have multi-million-dollar profits, multi-million-dollar tax bills, right, Toby?
Yeah.
And so that's mainly the people who have that over the long term is mainly big investment banks. So what's happened as a result of the financial crisis, big investment banks no longer have these big profits, and what happens is the incentive to invest in renewable energy basically just evaporates when that happens. So as a result, new wind installations have come to almost a complete standstill at the moment.
And where there's, again, Mariah mentioned earlier, there are new provisions under the ARRA that's the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. Yeah. We use the acronym, so I tend to forget what the actual thing means. Under that bill, there are new provisions that largely that are still tax-based, but that one of them is convertible into a grant. So that may help get around some of those hurdles, but it has been a big issue, and it has actually limited the investor pool. So the production tax credit, as Mariah mentioned, because it's based on tax liabilities, only certain investors, and very limited number of investors, in 2008, early 2008, before all this happened, there were anywhere from 14 to 18 investors in the wind power market in the United States. 14 to 18 large investors that were determining the future of the renewable energy market in the United States. That has now dropped to 4 as of the beginning of 2009. And there's a chance that that'll start to pick back up. But again, when companies don't have tax liabilities, you can't monetize that. So the production tax credit becomes useless. It's not that the incentive isn't there. It's there. You just don't have the tax liabilities to monetize. So it dries up the investment pool that can actually flow towards renewable energy development. So the other thing is that those tax investments compete. It's a bit of a sidebar, but those tax investments actually compete, what we call tax equity investments, compete with affordable housing because there are similar incentive structures for affordable housing. So if affordable housing is lower risk, some investors, and a lot of investment banks have been doing this, choosing to go with those because they're considered a lower risk investment under the current circumstance, and you don't have the production risk of wind power production over time because you don't know exactly how much wind is going to blow, et cetera. So that's really changed the platform on which the renewable energy industry in the U.S. operates, and it'll be interesting to see in the months to come how these new incentives will start to mobilize the market and whether new policies can actually help in some way to change the playing field to actually make it available to more than 14 to 18 investors. So I'll leave it at that.
All right. Next up is James Bradbury from Representative Jay Inslee's office.
Great. Thanks a lot, Mariah, and thanks to Washington Monthly New America Foundation for hosting this event. It's great to be a part of this discussion, a very important discussion at a very important time for our country and for policy in renewable energy and climate policy as well. So Congressman Inslee sits on the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House of Representatives, and so we're working right now very active in trying to help develop a new climate and energy policy for the U.S. And in the coming weeks, we'll be doing a series of legislative hearings on the discussion draft that Chairman Waxman and Chairman Markey have put forward, followed by some markups in subcommittee and full committee, hopefully passing a bill out of full committee by Memorial Day. That's the schedule we're under. It's a very aggressive schedule for some major policy issues. So it's really great to be here talking about this this issue today. So certainly from Mr. Inslee's perspective, and I know he shares this vision and this idea with the President Obama, is that smart energy policy, investments in clean energy and renewable energy create huge economic opportunities and opportunities for job growth. And we know certainly with feed-in tariffs in other countries, we've just seen unequivocally that there is that experience. It's not just about getting renewable energy online, but it's about creating an economy around that, and jobs involved in the installation, and knowing that there's that market there helps bring manufacturing, as that's come up here before in this discussion. So Mr. Inslee has long been a big supporter of renewables. He wrote a book, I guess it came out a year and a half ago now, called Apollo's Fire, Igniting America's Clean Energy Economy. And so this message that we're hearing from the President is something he's been saying for a long time, and a lot of his colleagues have as well. So it's exciting to see this opportunity right now to make some policy change, and it's clearly needed, I think, in this country. So the signs of political momentum, I would just say, I think are very impressive. As we've seen today, hearing about what's happening at the state levels, the interest at the state level. I think it's great to see Gainesville here. I'm happy to be sharing this experience with having a Gainesville representative, getting some time in the sun here inside the Beltway. I think it's really exciting. And I think this week is also an important week, frankly. The Maine state legislature introduced a bill, the Renewable Energy Sources Act. And I think, just sort of demonstrates kind of a massive political showing, really. We've got the Speaker of the House, House Majority Leader, House Majority Whip, Senate Majority Leader, and the Chair of the Key Energy Committee, all co-sponsors of the bill that was introduced. It was an aggressive feed-in tariff bill, and I'm not an expert on the bill. I know Mr. Couture has taken a closer look at it, and maybe he could speak to the details if people have questions. But I think that's quite impressive. Many other states, including Washington State, where my boss is from, has a bill that's been considered. The chair of Energy Committee introduced it. So this is something that's not just sort of around the periphery. I think it's getting a lot of top billing. A lot of legislatures are taking a serious look at it. And of course, Mr. Inslee introduced a type, sort of a feed-in tariff. It is a feed-in tariff bill. It was introduced last June, H.R. 6401. We have not reintroduced the bill yet this Congress. We're focusing our attention right now on this climate bill and climate and energy bill. A national feed-in tariff is not really on the table. Right now we're looking at a national RES in the context of this climate and energy policy. And I think it's a national feed-in tariff, I think, if it's designed well, and I think the bill that we introduced is designed well to work well in the context of the U.S., which is a very complicated regulatory framework, and it is very part because of jurisdictional issues between state and federal government. But I think our proposal really was set up in a way like the Highway Trust Fund, in the sense that all users of electricity would pay into a fund, but those states that would choose to implement this, or utilities that would choose to implement it, would be able to tap into that fund. It's very much the way the gas tax works in states that meet certain standards with regard to highway construction are able to tap the gas tax that all their citizens are paying. Similar to the way our bill was structured, to be respectful of states' rights, and there are a few other design elements that really make it so that it fits in the context of the U.S. policy framework that we have, and that's certainly important. Without a question. So, and certainly as we move forward, and we do plan to reintroduce the bill, absolutely. Certainly it'll be evolving, and we'll be doing our best to incorporate the lessons learned from Gainesville's experience and the best thinking that's put forward in new bills at the state level. And we continue to applaud the efforts at the state level, and we love to work with as closely with them as we can, as much as I have ability to reach out and work with them and trying to support their efforts. So I think just the last thing I'll say, just a little bit, I think there's probably interest in the cap and trade bill we're working on in that policy. And so I think It's a really comprehensive bill in terms of climate and energy. I think, as I mentioned, it does include a national renewable electricity standard, 25% renewable energy goal by 2025, which is consistent with President Obama's objectives, stated objectives during the campaign, and I believe since then. This is a good policy objective. Mr. Inslee is strongly supportive of this. We actually like big wind farms. We like big wind farms because they produce a lot of electrons that are zero carbon electrons. So, but we also really like distributed generation, and we like diversity of resources, and we think all of these are important. All of these are absolutely necessary if we're going to achieve the emissions reductions that absolutely we must achieve to really protect our planet and achieve the environmental, and the economic objectives that are really the policy goals that go hand in hand. And so, in the context of the bill before the Energy and Commerce Committee, there is this renewable electricity standard. It does have a section to support distributed generation, which is essentially a renewable energy credit multiplier. I believe it's a triple credit multiplier, and that would apply to any technology. My understanding is I think this helps, and it's the right idea. My understanding is there are better mechanisms, frankly, to get strong distributed generation deployment, particularly for things like solar, which are a little more expensive than some other technologies they'd be competing with. So obviously, Mr. Inslee is supportive of a cost-based rate setting through a feed-in tariff mechanism. We like the idea of distributed generation and supporting a range of technologies, as I said. So the renewable electricity standard doesn't have any money that comes along with it. This is a mandate for the states to meet. And as I said, we think that's good policy. We think it makes sense. In the context of this bill, there's also a lot of allowances, emissions allowances that Congress will have to decide what to do with. Some will be given to utilities, some will be given to industry, some will be sold at auction, and the revenue from those auctions will be recycled back for many number of purposes. I think most in Congress heard, President Obama's proposal to use some revenues from an auction to fund other important policy priorities, such as tax cuts for middle class folks, and for health care for all Americans. I mean, these are the kind of things that certainly my boss shares, those policy objectives. But I think a lot of people on Capitol Hill are saying, well, I think if we're going to have revenue from a cap-and-trade program, from carbon permits, we should take that revenue or the value of those allowances and make sure to put it back toward the purpose of achieving the overall goal of the program. And many of us, including my boss, would love to see a good portion of the value of these allowances, the allowances themselves or auction revenue, going to distributed generation. And we're working on that and would love to see, hopefully, a bill that goes through subcommittee or at very least through full committee will include some more explicit treatment of how to support money to go to distributed generation. There are real societal benefits to this. I think if we structure it right, we can essentially send some money out to the parts of the country that, frankly, have some. There are a lot of folks who have members of Congress have concerns about a renewable electricity standard, who say, well, we don't actually necessarily have the best resources in my district or in my state. Why should I support this? Well, I think this could certainly help them out if they know that there's going to be some revenue coming in from the broader program. It will help their local utilities meet that target and help their citizens invest in the technologies that help us all meet these policy goals. So that's what we're working on currently. We certainly like the idea of production incentives, and I think that we can learn some lessons from the success of the feed-in tariff model and apply that to, I think, production incentives that achieve these policy goals. So that's where we're coming from, and I think I'll wrap it up and pass it on for now. Thanks.
Next, we'll hear from David Owens from the Edison Electric Institute.
Thank you. I appreciate this opportunity to be with you today, and I will say I'm impressed with my panelists. I'm kind of the memory from the past, and what I'd like to do is just take a little bit of time. Let me put in context what I want to talk about. I think there's some valuable lessons that we have learned from a law called the Public Utilities Regulatory Policy Act, or PURPA. So I want to say a couple of things about PURPA to provide a context. Just as Mr. Inslee's staff talked about the context of what we're dealing with today, I think we need to have a good grasp of what we're dealing with respect to feed-in tariffs and all the other legislative proposals that are before the Congress, which really do impact consumers. And then I want to talk about a path forward. And in doing so, I want to distinguish feed-in tariffs used for centralized sources versus feed-in tariffs used for decentralized sources, because I think it's very important. I think the panelists, to some degree, seem to go back and forth. I think it's very important that we make a distinction. I'm told that 30 years ago there was a law called the Public Utilities Regulatory Policies Act. Actually, I was pretty actively involved in that. PURPA, it was called. And there was a policy goal. And the policy goal was that we wanted to get the U.S. off of oil. We wanted to be energy independent. And under PURPA, we had, very much like we do under the dialogue that we've had this morning, we had the goal that in order to promote solar, wind, geothermal, biomass, small power production, that we had to create a guaranteed market and we had to create a guaranteed price. The guaranteed price was what we called avoided costs. That was the cost that it would have cost the utility if it produced the energy itself or if it purchased it from someone else. Utilities were required to interconnect with the small-scale sources and large-scale sources. They were required to provide backup and standby service. That was a policy goal of our nation. That was a national program, and the states were given the responsibility to implement that program. The authorities were delegated to the individual states by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, who was given the responsibility to carry out these important areas. There was a tremendous movement in our nation that we needed to become energy independent, and we needed to stimulate the development of these technologies, as well as cogeneration, which is a dual use of energy. I still strongly believe in those policy goals. Several years later, 20 years later, we had another policy goal. That policy goal was to stimulate the development of competitive markets, competitive wholesale electricity markets. Now, obviously, those who were in the PURPA regime and those who were in the competitive market regime clashed. Because you can't have a guaranteed market and a guaranteed price at the same time you have a competitive market. You just can't. And so the policy goal of competition said we have to adjust the PURPA goal. And if there's a competitive market, those technologies will flourish because the market will dictate a price. And those technologies will move based upon market behaviors. We are now looking at another policy goal. That policy goal is how do we reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Now there's a whole broad approach. We know there's no single technology that's a panacea to this issue. But we do know that there's a basket load of options. One option is energy efficiency, the lowest hanging fruit. A second option could be renewable technologies. A third option, many believe, is a zero-emitting source, such as nuclear. And then there's the way of how do we use coal more efficiently and burn it more efficiently, and that's carbon capture and storage. And then there's the recognition that we need to go to plug-in hybrid electric vehicles and so forth. That's the debate in Congress today. That's a policy goal. Our Congress is saying, how do we deal with greenhouse gas emissions? Now, I learned a lot of lessons when I looked at PURPA. In PURPA, many customers were paying rates higher than what the true cost of electricity was. I recall in New York, there was a minimum price, and much like in a feed-in tariff, there was a minimum price there was a set price that utilities had to pay, a fixed price. That's the word I was looking for. 6 cents a kilowatt hour. The actual cost of energy at that time was 3 cents a kilowatt hour. What's my point? My point is that we have to move in an evolutionary rather than a revolutionary way as we look at these issues. And I do believe that there are tremendous benefits that do flow from feed-in tariffs. And I believe the panel here illustrated many of those. And the panel here illustrated as well that in the United States they're evolving. They're evolving community by community. Where I have difficulty is if we seek to take another national approach, which gives me the nightmares of PURPA. I believe that we have a range of options that are available to stimulate the development of renewables. They may not be totally sufficient. The question becomes, aside from the policies, how do we balance interests? And I believe that there are three kinds of interests that we're seeking to balance. We're seeking to balance the project developer because we believe it's important that we move these technologies. We're seeking to balance the interests of the customer who takes service and pays energy prices. And to the degree that the utility is not involved, you're seeking to balance the interests of the utility who has the obligation to serve or the obligation to make sure those markets work, whether it be a public utility or whether it be a private utility, as the kinds of utilities that I seek to represent, that I do represent. It was mentioned earlier that the Congress is debating very comprehensive energy legislation. And let's talk about these three interests that I just made reference to. That comprehensive energy bill, one of those bills, the Waxman-Markey draft proposal, has a national policy goal that they're seeking to accomplish. The President has a vision to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 80% by 2050. And this legislation is suggesting that there are, among options, three major options that need to be considered. One of those are a stringent cap on carbon emissions, which obviously will drive energy prices up. But this is necessary. We need to have a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. A second is a mandatory renewable energy standard, which will stimulate the development of renewable technologies, 25% by 2025. And to the degree that you can develop those renewables, you can buy them at 5 cents a kilowatt hour. Well, for most utilities, most customers, that's 25% increase in their basic price. And then on top of that, there is a mandatory energy efficiency standard of a goal of 15% by 2020. These are the broad options to deal with greenhouse gas emissions, which I believe all of those options should be employed. What's my point? My point is this, that if you took a mandatory climate policy, a cap and trade policy, you layer on top of that a renewable portfolio standard, you layer on top of that a mandatory energy efficiency standard, and you layer on top of that a feed-in tariff. Whose interests are we seeking to balance here? That will become very, very costly for consumers. That's why I take the position, from my experience in PURPA, from my experience in many of the public policy debates, that gradualism, rather than taking a revolutionary approach, is preferred. City of Gainesville has benefited tremendously. Job creation, and they tailored a program that met their local needs. And my belief is that as we evolve in the United States with feed-in tariffs, we have to do it not on a national basis where we mandate it. We need to do it in an evolutionary way, community, state, in an evolutionary way, not in a revolutionary way. We have to balance the interests. I believe we can achieve our goals of greenhouse gas emissions by preserving all the options, but I have great difficulty if one of the policy goals says, let's on top of all the other things impose a national feed-in tariff approach. Thank you.
And PURPA actually, just to be clear, was actually essentially a feed-in tariff. The pricing structure was different than the pricing structure in Germany.
That's right.
But as a result of the way the pricing structure was set, utilities in some places ended up with long-term contracts that were with rates that were substantially higher than the retail price of electricity, right? So there's some wariness in the United States about this policy.
And California was one great example where there was a gold rush of small power producers because the price was forecast incorrectly. And if we all thought we knew what the price of natural gas was going to be. We all thought the price of oil was going to be $100 a barrel. It never achieved there. But many companies were paying a price and avoided costs, which was approaching much like the price of, much close to the price of $100 a barrel.
I just wanted to say, I think one important point there you just made, that it was the price was pegged to the price for the new renewable generators was pegged to the price of natural gas. That's a policy choice to do it that way, as avoided cost. I think a feed-in tariff is different, and in that it's pegged to the cost of generating renewables. So that is certainly a different pricing structure.
It's still a derived cost. That was my point.
What is a derived cost?
A derived cost means that you believe that you know what the cost of the technology will be, and you'll project that cost out, and on top of that, you will impose a rate of return. So we believe that we know what the cost of a technology will be. And as you move smaller scale technologies, perhaps you probably do, and the impact on the consumer will not be as significant. But larger scale technologies, and that was the difficulty with PURPA. None of us, smart as I think I am, I don't think I can project the cost of labor, all the input costs associated with producing a power supply source. I think the feed-in tariff has a better approach. I don't want you to get that impression that I don't believe it has a better approach. It's all the administrative added costs that make it very, very complicated. Any projections are very difficult.
No, I think those are great points. I really appreciate some of the comments that you raised, and I hope we have a chance anyway to discuss a lot of this further, because I think it is a very important debate for a lot of different reasons. Two things come to mind, just to clarify. PURPA, as was mentioned, was based on the avoided cost, so it was a projection. We said that's where natural gas is trending, and that's what we should peg the price to. Under a feed-in tariff, it's a completely different approach, and it is, in a lot of ways, very similar, and in some ways virtually indistinguishable from the approach that's used in the conventional regulated electricity market. So if you're building a nuclear power plant, for example, you come forward and you submit your capital costs, your O&M, your variable O&M, your fuel costs, you bundle all that together, and then you say, my cost of electricity is going to be somewhere in this range, and I expect a 15 to 18% rate of return on that investment. And you submit that to the utility or the Public Utility Commission, as the case may be, and you get a power purchase agreement for a guaranteed period of time. So you get a long-term contract. Nuclear power can only, some disagree now, there's merchant approaches that are starting to emerge, but an example like a nuclear power with a high upfront capital cost, which is similar to solar in its cost structure, requires a long-term contract. And you do the same thing. You do your due diligence. You do the analysis on what your capital costs are, your O&M costs, your labor, all those inputs, and you bundle it in and you get what's called a levelized purchase price over time. And that purchase price is adequate to guarantee some target rate of return. So the crucial, really a feed-in tariff in that regard, when you take a step back, is not very different from what we do in conventional electricity markets. The only differences are that they're for renewable energy sources as opposed to fossil or nuclear sources, and that they're open to everyone. So the prices are set forward, as opposed to on a bilateral basis. So with a nuclear power plant, it's a bilateral contract, and the details of that are not known. They're not publicly available. A feed-in tariff, the administrative requirement is done up front. So it's true that it does require the administrative requirement to actually analyze, okay, what does solar cost? What does wind power cost? But once that's done, you then post the price, and you let the market determine the quantity of renewable energy development that will take place. So the price is posted and is transparent based on that analysis. And this is what Gainesville has done with their solar analysis. They came up with a price of 32 cents. In Southern California, it may not need to be 32. They may have a slightly better solar resource. It could be as low as 28. It could be 25. Similar with wind resources. The Texas Panhandle can generate wind power for in the range of 5 cents per kilowatt hour. If you're looking in the interior, there might be places where the wind doesn't blow quite as strong, and your levelized cost is somewhere more around 9 or 10, maybe 12 or 13 cents a kilowatt hour. So the important thing is that the feed-in tariff, in order to be cost efficient, has to take into account all those differences. And on the question of price impact, so I could kind of go on a little bit, and I'd be glad to hear questions and sort of get into these issues a little further, but we are fairly limited. The average electricity price in the U.S. now, according to the Energy Information Administration, if you average it throughout the states, is a little over 11 cents across the country. Now, some places it's less, but a number of renewable energy sources can currently be developed for less than that, and are being developed for less than that. So while it's true that certain renewable energy sources will put upward pressure on costs, like solar, for example, there are a wide diversity of renewable energy technologies and renewable energy sources that can be generated for less than the average electricity price. So I think the debate around cost is a more nuanced one than the way in which it's often framed. And there is a sense in which we've actually even seen from data in I raise this because it's an important dimension when you think of ratepayer impact, and we've been doing a lot of analysis on this, is that in countries like Germany, in particular, I'll take two examples, Denmark and Spain, both experienced a decrease in their electricity prices from the feed-in tariff because they had all this contracted wind. It was all at a fixed price, so they had all the, except Spain's a little different, but they had all these long-term wind contracts, and the wind was actually putting downward pressure because it was cheaper than the alternative, which was natural gas. So from 2005 to 2007, both Denmark and Spain, from the data that we've seen, have experienced decreases in their electricity prices. Spain is a deregulated market, so prices fluctuate on a spot basis. They've experienced decreases in the electricity price anywhere from 8 to 25% from the wind power. Now, admittedly, the solar power in Spain puts upward pressure, but with the wind power, the average sort of net balance is positive for ratepayers because wind is currently, or at least in 2007 was, from 2005 to 7, was cheaper than natural gas. Okay. So it puts a little bit of context, and I think it's important to have that as a bit of a, to nuance the argument a little around the renewable energy, because we're starting to see the trends broadly are shifting. We're
Toby,
seeing renewable energy.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we're running a little short on time, so I think maybe we should take questions from the audience now.
Well, I hope that was helpful in any case. My apologies.
No, very helpful, and I'm sorry that I had to cut you short. It's just...
That was good. See your passion.
Okay. This gentleman here.
Hi, Stephen Dahl, returned from Oxford University recently. I'm curious, it seems like there's a sort of underlying debate about who's going to win and who's going to lose from these new policies. It seems like we all agree feed-in tariffs look like the right things for innovation, build a strong sector, and all this. But I get the sense the existing investor-owned utilities or maybe other participants don't like it.
If you mind, maybe David and I can talk about that.
Sure.
The gentleman that just asked a question says, yes, there are winners and losers. In most policies, there are always going to be winners and losers. One of the things, the joy and the hurt about being in the utility business is that, there's all this risk and the forecasts are bad and so on and so forth, but you know what? We have to do something. We have to keep the lights on. And in my professional career, we set rates, we come up with all kinds of policies. There's always winners and losers. I'm sure that's true at a federal level and so on and so forth.
I guess my comment is there's no panacea. When I gave all the examples of PURPA and our shifting energy policy, I was really kind of trying to cite a lesson here. And where I have a difficulty, if we're seeking to now mandate or recreate something that I believe PURPA had a day, I have great difficulty if we're seeking to move a national policy that would suggest that you have a requirement to buy energy from a particular source at a cost that's guaranteed over a period of time. I believe in competitive markets, and I believe that the markets can make those decisions. And as was stated earlier, if these technologies are so cost competitive, then the market can make those decisions. I don't think we need to have the federal government mandate a policy in that direction. I also do believe that we need to have flexibility to let the individual states and the counties take on. Comments were made about what was occurring in Europe, but Europe is not monolithic. Spain is very different than Denmark, as was pointed out here. And our states are very different as well. So I have great difficulty if we're seeking to move a national policy in this direction. I have no difficulty if local communities see economic development stimulating from this, as they have seen in Gainesville. So my view is that we have to proceed in an evolutionary approach rather than a revolutionary approach.
To follow on, if I may, PURPA is one example where maybe there were some winners and losers. But boy, PURPA, in terms of the impact on utilities in Florida, was nothing compared to the Clean Air Act in terms of the winners and losers on who had to invest in scrubbers and who didn't invest in scrubbers. I mean, that was huge. That was a 20% hit in our utility rates right there. Another big example is the competition policies that Mr. Owens referred to, creating the ISOs and the RTOs. They were huge winners and losers, and those regions are still trying to figure all that out. And so in many ways, what we're talking about here is small compared to some of the experiments. You know, the beauty of a social experiment is you don't have a control. But we have done some major things in America that what we're talking about here, you know, what we're doing is we're obviously committed to subsidizing renewable energy. The federal tax credits alone, I don't know how many billions of dollars a year that is. In Germany, they just said, we're not going to do it that way, we're going to do it this other way. So we're spending a buku money on this thing, and the question is if you're going to spend the money, let's try to figure out a policy that really gets your objective, and there are always going to be winners and losers.
I just wanted to clarify that, as I said earlier in my remarks, that we're not, a mandated federal feed-in tariff's not on the table. We're not proposing it in the context of this cap-and-trade program. The Inslee bill is not a federal mandate. The one extent that it would be a wires charge on customers to pay for the program, which is
that's a mandate,
which is identical to a wires charge in former Chairman Boucher's bill, which would support a fund that is supported by a number of investor-owned utilities to support investment in carbon capture and storage. And Mr. Inslee is a big supporter of investments in carbon capture, storage, research, and development and deployment, but the point is that this is essentially identical in terms of its, to the extent that Mr. Inslee's bill is a mandate.
James, can you tell us what a wire charge is, please?
It's essentially a customer, it's a charge for electrons that go across the wires. So
okay. It's
a rate that is passed on to customers to support a certain, whatever, particular policy goal. And in this case, it's a wires charge for carbon capture and storage. That proposal is in the discussion draft with the wires charge, and the feed-in tariff is not.
And as I understand it, the feed-in tariff bill that's been proposed by Mr. Inslee is that essentially the way it works is that all customers get charged essentially, right? There's a cost but states have the option of whether or not to implement it. There's an incentive, right? Because is that a correct interpretation? There's an incentive because the customers in your state get charged whether or not you're allowed to get paid for installing solar panels on your roof, but your state is not required to enact it.
That's right. Yeah, that's the approach. As I said, it's similar to the Highway Trust Fund in that way. Of course, every state does the Highway Trust Fund. And I just wanted to clarify, I think what this discussion is useful is it does show that there needs to be an upside for the utilities. If we're going to do a proposal if Congress is going to pass anything that's anything like a feed-in tariff, there needs to be an upside. There needs to be a financial revenue stream that the utilities are able to earn a profit and have an upside and have a benefit. Ultimately, that's essentially, to me, why I see that there is political support from utilities for a wires charge for carbon capture storage. It's helping the incumbents achieve the goals of the emissions reductions, and I think if we can design it well, I think the same sort of thing could work with a renewable energy deployment.
The upside that Germany, for example, put into their policies was that a utility can participate in a feed-in tariff program. Exactly. They can develop their own wind projects, that's right, whatever. But the downside, along with that, is that now you're dividing the pie up, in smaller pieces. There's really nothing better to be in a regulated monopoly, I can tell you right now.
Let's take another question.
Or to be a public entity that doesn't pay taxes.
There you go. That's the other one.
Hi, my name is Abdul Ahmed from Arizona State University. My question is, the cost-based price setting, is it going to lead to a suboptimal condition of production? In other words, it seems that it's some sort of a monopoly, maybe at a lower level, by trying to diversify, decentralize production, but you still have this element whereby you average out the cost to everybody. And you all mentioned the word evolutionary. Evolutionary process is a natural selection. And there should be a mechanism whereby the consumers or the public in general could generally select something, and that would evolve. If technology has not evolved to the point where it could compete with traditional production of energy, then why are we forcing this ourselves?
So there's a number.
Do you want to take
yeah,
that?
I'll take a
Would
quick,
you want to?
try to keep it
What was the
short.
question specifically?
Well, there's a number of different. Energy policy to some degree has always been political. We've subsidized energy since Roman times. You could probably push it back further with a little bit more historical, but energy has always had that dimension. So we are currently part of the challenge is that any new technology, not even just renewable, but that applies for carbon capture, for any other type of new technology in the market, competes against a heavily subsidized and amortized electricity supply infrastructure. So it's already paid for in a lot of cases. You have large hydro built, large coal built, large nuclear. That's all been paid for. That was expensive at the time. Getting new supply on board is also, so I don't know if that addresses your...
So electricity was cheaper than kerosene, or was cheaper than whatever was being used at the time. It wasn't that somebody came or the government came and produced this. It's probably a false notion to assume that government always forces things in. These things occur because they're better. Now, I would say in Arizona, where I'm from, solar would be a good thing. I'm not sure if solar is going to be a good thing for Portland, having a federal bill to force people to,
So,
cost.
No, I think that's a great point. And actually, after maybe we can take a minute to one way that I think I would frame that was that in a market economy, we often take the auto sector. You can buy a smaller car for a lower price, or you can buy an Audi. It's going to have a higher price tag, but it's a higher quality product as well. So in a market economy, we have a differential pricing structure for different types of things. Renewable energy is a different type of, the electrons are the same once they get on the wires, but it has other benefits that distinguish it on a qualitative level from conventional fossil generation or nuclear generation. So I think similarly to the sense in which we pay different prices for different commodities in a market economy, renewable energy is a different commodity than conventional energy. So there might be some economic. I appreciate the point, though. I think it's a great and very interesting argument. So maybe after we can, instead of monopolizing the time, I'd love to take that further.
All right. Take Randy Hayes. Yes.
Thanks. Hi, Randy Hayes from the World Future Council. I understand how feed-in tariffs democratize the production of energy, and you know, that sounds like a good thing. Someday I'd like to hear some of the giant utility companies take a strong stand in favor of that, but I don't think that's going to be today. My question, though, is really about price. I also understand that there's an initial increased price, slight increase of price that we've seen in various countries. But I also hear that when large quantities of renewable are online, we're seeing a decrease in price because they can shut down natural gas peakers and things like that to save money. So can somebody speak to, over the medium and long term, how will this feed-in tariff policy affect the price?
And I think Toby actually already addressed that question, right? To
Yeah,
a certain degree?
to an extent. So with the marginal supply that renewables are competing against, at least today, for the most part, now it's not a blanket statement, but for the most part, is natural gas. Some baseload renewable generation, like geothermal and biomass, can displace coal, can displace baseload sources. But by and large, the marginal supply that it's competing against is natural gas. So your actual cost benefit will be a function of the natural gas price. So if natural gas prices go way up, then renewables will be offering a tremendous hedge benefit against that. In other words, lower prices against that volatile or high natural gas price. But again, that's entirely a function of natural gas from a strictly economic standpoint. But I think I hope that answers the question.
Okay, and I'm going to take one more question. This gentleman here in the third row. I have you in the gold tie.
Yes, this, I believe, it picks up on a point made by Mr. Reagan, but I believe it's for Mr. Couture. The solar used in Gainesville presumably backs out natural gas as their highest variable cost generation. I can't do the numbers in my head, but if you calculate that on a cost per ton of CO2 reduced, it is very, very, very high. So you're spending money to encourage the deployment specifically of solar. Has your laboratory addressed the question of whether that same amount of money would achieve a greater impact in deploying solar through putting the same number of millions, tens of millions of dollars into R&D?
I mean, it's hard to quantify ahead of time the impacts of any R&D investment. R&D always has a venture capital aspect to it. You invest and you hope that new breakthroughs and new technology will result, that will actually increase efficiencies or introduce new products into the market. I think I mean, some people would argue, even within the utility or even inside and outside the utility sector, or the energy sector for that matter, that money would be better allocated to things like demand-side management or energy efficiency, because that's considered lower-hanging fruit. You can often deliver energy efficiency for 1 to 2 cents per kilowatt hour. So why would we be contracting solar for, so there's a good argument to be made in the near term for energy efficiency and demand reduction, because there's a tremendous amount of low-hanging fruit in the market. Now, I think that's an important thing to keep in mind in all of this. Energy efficiency is still and will remain our lowest cost resource above any other supply, even coal or natural gas or nuclear, however you pick it. But the problem, or the only shortcoming, if one can point one out, of energy efficiency is that it assumes that there's nothing wrong with I don't mean wrong in the moral sense, but that there's nothing problematic about the current energy supply mix. Efficiency is just reducing demand. And there's an argument to be made in favor of diversifying and sort of to essentially diversify our renewable energy, or our supply mix, to include more renewable energy sources. So that's another policy goal that would justify the use of, or that would justify a supply-based policy, like a feed-in tariff. So it's to drive new supply to presumably displace alternatives.
If I could address that, that same issue has come up a lot in our public discussions, and the way that we kind of see it in Gainesville is, first of all, part of that argument means that nobody would have ever bought a personal computer. There's always going to be a better one, but unless you create the demand for that product, or unless there's a demand for that product, that R&D doesn't mean anything. I mean, the second thing is that if you flip the equation around and you don't start by saying what's the most cost effective, which is the conventional way of looking at it, you say, what is there the most of? It ain't wind. Wind is caused by the sun. It ain't biomass. We can ruin our planet by harvesting all the biomass. We're doing a big biomass project, and we're going through a lot of agony on the sustainability of that. And it's everything that's being pushed by the sun. So if we can lick the equation with the sun, heck, Mother Nature's already done it, then you really have something. So that's kind of how I would point out your argument is that you really have to take a portfolio approach, and you have to prime the pump, and you have to prime the pump where you have the biggest aquifer.
I think we're going to have to wrap it up now. Thank you all for coming out. And if anybody else has questions, they can feel free to come up and ask the panelists directly.
Thank you.